They were taught to fear America long before they ever saw it, long before any Japanese soldier stepped onto a Pacific island or any civilian heard the distant thunder of bombs. From childhood, many Japanese people absorbed an image of the United States carefully shaped by education, government messaging, newspapers, radio programs, and military culture. America was not simply another nation across the ocean. It was presented as a symbol of everything Japan believed it was not. Where Japan emphasized discipline, restraint, hierarchy, and sacrifice, America was described as indulgent, chaotic, shallow, and morally weak. This contrast was repeated so often that it became part of everyday thinking, settling quietly into conversations at home, in classrooms, and in barracks. To the Japanese public, America was portrayed as a land of excess. Its people were said to eat too much, waste too much, and value pleasure over duty. Hollywood films, jazz music, and consumer goods were often cited as proof of a society that had lost its spiritual core. American democracy was described not as freedom but as disorder, a system where selfish individuals argued endlessly instead of obeying authority. Japanese propaganda insisted that such a society could not endure the hardships of real war. It might have factories and money, but it lacked the inner strength that came from obedience, unity, and willingness to die for the emperor. Among soldiers, this idea was drilled even deeper. Military training emphasized that American troops depended on machines rather than courage, on firepower rather than resolve. Japanese recruits were told that Americans feared death and would retreat if faced with determined resistance. The belief in spiritual superiority was central. Japanese ideology taught that the Yamato spirit, rooted in loyalty and honor, made one Japanese soldier worth many enemies. America, in contrast, was seen as a nation individuals fighting for pay, comfort, or abstract ideals, rather than sacred duty. This belief helped prepare soldiers psychologically for brutal combat by convincing them that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. Yet, even as this image spread, it existed alongside a strange fascination. America was enormous, wealthy, and technologically advanced. Japanese newspapers could not entirely hide the scale of American industry or the size of its cities. Ships, automobiles, skyscrapers, and factories inspired both contempt and curiosity. How could a nation portrayed as lazy and undisciplined produce so much? How could people obsessed with leisure build such powerful machines? These questions rarely surfaced openly, but they lingered quietly in the background, especially among the educated and the skeptical. For civilians, especially those who had never traveled abroad, America felt distant and almost mythical. It was a place known through images and stories rather than experience. Farmers in rural villages imagined Americans as enormous, loud people who laughed too much and understood nothing of tradition. Urban residents might have encountered American products or music before the war, creating a conflicted impression, attraction mixed with disapproval. Some young people secretly admired American fashion or films, even as they publicly denounced them. The official message demanded rejection, but curiosity was harder to suppress. As tensions rose and war approached, this image hardened. After Pearl Harbor, America became the primary enemy, and the language used to describe it grew more extreme. Americans were depicted as ruthless capitalists, racially inferior yet dangerously cunning, driven by greed rather than honor. Dehumanizing language became common, making it easier to justify violence and sacrifice. The war was framed not just as a military struggle, but as a moral and cultural clash between purity and corruption, spirit and materialism, tradition and decay. Within Japan's leadership, perceptions of America were more complicated. Some military planners respected American industrial capacity and feared a long war. But these concerns were often overshadowed by ideology and confidence. Underestimating the enemy became easier when filtered through belief. America's diversity was interpreted as weakness, its comfort as softness, its democracy as indecision. Victory was imagined as swift and decisive, forcing Americans to negotiate once they tasted hardship. For ordinary soldiers leaving home, these beliefs provided reassurance. Facing an enemy described as weak made fear manageable. Letters and diaries reveal young men repeating phrases they had been taught, convincing themselves that the Americans they would meet were nothing like them, nothing to be respected. This mental distance helped them cross the threshold into violence. To hesitate was to doubt not only the war, but the identity they had been given. At the same time, there were cracks even before combat began. Japanese sailors who saw American ships from a distance noted their size and number. Pilots, studying reconnaissance photos, could not ignore the scale of American bases. Some officers privately questioned the narrative, but discipline and hierarchy discouraged open dissent. To challenge the official view was to risk being seen as disloyal or weak-minded. Silence became safer than honesty. Thus, as the war began, Japan carried into it a carefully constructed vision of America, rich but empty, powerful but fragile, technologically impressive yet spiritually inferior. It was an image designed to strengthen resolve and justify sacrifice, but it rested on assumptions rather than experience. For most Japanese people, America was not yet real. It was an idea, a caricature, a warning, and a challenge all at once. Only later, when blood was spilled and cities burned, would that imagined enemy begin to collide with reality, forcing painful reassessment. The moment Japan and America truly collided, the carefully built image of the enemy began to strain under the weight of reality. For many Japanese soldiers, the first encounters with Americans did not come in grand decisive battle, but in flashes of movement, bursts of gunfire, and the sudden roar of engines in the sky. Pilots who had expected timid opponents instead found American aircraft aggressively pressing attacks, diving straight into danger with confidence and coordination. Sailors who believed enemy crews would panic under pressure watched American ships continue firing even while burning. These early clashes planted the first seeds of doubt, though few were willing to acknowledge them openly. On the ground, Japanese infantry units soon realized that the American soldier did not behave as predicted. He did not always flee when confronted. He advanced methodically, supported by artillery, air power, and logistics that seemed to appear from nowhere. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hunger, disease, and exhaustion with minimal supplies, believing this made them superior. Yet they were startled by how efficiently Americans maintained their strength. Fresh rations, medical care, and replacement equipment arrived with astonishing regularity. The enemy did not rely solely on courage. He relied on organization, planning, and overwhelming support. This did not mean respect came easily. Many Japanese accounts from the early stages of the Pacific War still describe Americans as careless and noisy, firing excessively and revealing their position. To Japanese soldiers trained in stealth and patience, this behavior looked foolish, but the results told a different story. The sheer volume of fire, combined with coordinated movement, often forced Japanese units to withdraw or be destroyed. Slowly, an uncomfortable realization took shape. Americans could afford inefficiency because they possessed abundance. What looked like wastefulness was backed by resources that seemed endless. As battles stretched on, the sense of America as an unstoppable machine grew stronger. Each time a Japanese unit inflicted losses, new American units arrived. Ships sunk in one battle were replaced by more ships in the next. Airfields destroyed were rebuilt, sometimes larger than before. This relentless replacement eroded morale. Japanese soldiers had been taught that endurance would break the enemy's will, but America showed little sign of exhaustion. Instead, its presence expanded, pressing closer to Japan with each campaign. Personal encounters further complicated perception. Japanese soldiers captured by Americans often expected brutal treatment, having been warned that the enemy was cruel and vengeful. Instead, many were shocked to receive food, water, and medical attention. Guards were firm but not sadistic. This experience clashed violently with everything they had been taught. Some prisoners struggled to reconcile the idea of a morally corrupt enemy with behavior that appeared restrained and procedural. Even so, these experiences were rarely shared widely during the war, as shame and censorship kept them hidden. In the air war, Japanese pilots developed a deep respect for American skill and training. Early in the conflict, Japanese aviators had enjoyed advantages in maneuverability and experience, but as time passed, they noticed American pilots learning quickly, adapting tactics, and improving coordination. New aircraft appeared, faster, tougher, and more heavily armed. What unsettled Japanese airmen most was the confidence of their opponents. Americans pressed attacks aggressively, trusting their machines and formation. The enemy no longer looked clumsy or naive. He looked prepared and determined. At sea, the image of American industrial might become impossible to ignore. Carrier task forces operated with precision, launching wave after wave of aircraft. Japanese sailors spoke of American fleets as if they were living entities moving with purpose and rhythm. The loss of experienced Japanese crews could not be easily replaced, while America seemed to produce trained personnel at an astonishing rate. This imbalance reshaped how America was viewed, no longer merely a nation of indulgent civilians, but a system capable of converting wealth into power with terrifying efficiency. Among Japanese civilians, the war brought America closer in a different way. As American bombers appeared over Japanese cities, the enemy ceased to be an abstract idea. The sound of engines, the wail of sirens, and the sight of flames transformed perception. Fear replaced ideology. America became associated with destruction from above, an invisible force that struck without warning. Yet, even here, perceptions were conflicted. Some civilians were surprised by leaflets dropped before bombing raids, warning of attacks and urging evacuation. This behavior confused people who had been told Americans were barbaric and heartless. Rumors spread despite censorship. Stories of American kindness to prisoners, of respectful treatment of civilians in occupied areas, circulated quietly. At the same time, anger grew over bombings that devastated neighborhoods and killed families. America was seen simultaneously as merciless and strangely restrained, brutal in power, but controlled in intent. This contradiction made the enemy harder to understand and more unsettling. Japanese soldiers at the front experienced a gradual emotional shift. Initial contempt gave way to caution, then to a grim respect. They learned to study American tactics seriously rather than dismissing them. Diaries and letters reveal this change in tone, though often expressed indirectly. Instead of boasting about enemy weakness, writers began describing enemy strength, equipment, and coordination in detail. This was not admiration, but acknowledgement. The caricature no longer fit. Still, ideology did not disappear. Many Japanese soldiers continued to believe in spiritual superiority even as material disadvantage became obvious. America was seen as powerful but soulless, victorious but lacking honor. This belief helped some cope with the reality of defeat on the battlefield. If the enemy won through machines rather than spirit, then loss did not mean moral failure. In this way, the old image adapted rather than vanished. As casualties mounted and retreats became common, America came to represent inevitability. Soldiers spoke of fighting not to win, but to delay. Civilians began to understand that the war was not unfolding as promised. America was not collapsing under hardship, it was advancing with patience and scale. The enemy, once dismissed as weak, now felt overwhelming. By the middle years of the war, Japan's view of America had transformed from contemptuous dismissal into uneasy recognition. The United States was no longer a caricature of indulgence and decay. It was a disciplined, industrial, adaptive force capable of learning from mistakes and sustaining pressure without visible strain. This realization did not bring acceptance or peace. Instead, it deepened fear, hardened resolve, and pushed Japan further into a war it could no longer realistically win. Yet even in this recognition, full understanding remained incomplete. Japanese soldiers and civilians saw only fragments of America, its weapons, its aircraft, its bombs, its uniforms. They encountered power more than people. The deeper truth of American society, its internal divisions, doubts, and debates, remained largely unseen. America was still in many ways an idea rather than a nation of individuals, and that incomplete understanding would shape the final, tragic phase of the war, when perceptions, desperation, and reality collided with devastating consequences. By the final years of the war, the way Japan viewed America was no longer shaped by theory or propaganda alone, but by hunger, exhaustion, fear, and loss. The enemy had moved from distant abstraction to unavoidable presence. American planes filled the skies. American submarines stalked the seas, and American power pressed closer with every month. For Japanese civilians, America became a sound before it was a sight, the deep mechanical thunder of bombers, the rising scream of air raid sirens, the heavy silence afterward broken only by fire and collapse. Fear replaced ideology, survival replaced belief. In cities, people learned to read the sky. Children were taught how to drop to the ground, how to cover their heads, how to run through smoke. Mothers packed emergency bundles, knowing they might never return home. The enemy was no longer a caricature of weakness or moral decay. America was a force that could reach anywhere, anytime. Yet, even in terror, confusion persisted. People asked how a nation supposedly obsessed with comfort could carry out such relentless destruction. How could soft people build such merciless machines? The old explanations no longer worked. As firebombing intensified, hatred toward America deepened among many civilians. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. Families were erased. For those who survived, America appeared cruel beyond comprehension. Yet, alongside rage, a strange resignation grew. Some whispered that only America had the power to end the war, even if ending it meant Japan's ruin. These thoughts were dangerous, rarely spoken aloud, but they spread quietly as suffering mounted. Among soldiers, the perception of America reached its darkest complexity. By this stage, many no longer believed victory was possible. They fought because they were ordered to, because retreat was dishonor, because surrender felt unimaginable. America was seen as overwhelming, methodical, and patient. Unlike earlier enemies in Japan's history, it did not rush blindly. It advanced carefully, crushing resistance with superior coordination. This made America terrifying not because it was savage, but because it was controlled. Japanese troops facing invasion forces understood that they were facing not just soldiers, but a system. Every rifleman was backed by artillery, every artillery unit by ships, every ship by factories thousands of miles away. America felt endless. To fight it was to fight time itself. This realization broke spirits even as it hardened resolve. Some soldiers clung more fiercely to the belief of spiritual superiority convincing themselves that even if they died, they would prove something America could never understand. The use of kamikaze attacks reflected this mindset. To many Japanese pilots, America represented a world that valued life too much to comprehend voluntary death. Crashing into American ships was meant not only to destroy steel, but to demonstrate moral difference. America was seen as strong yet incomplete, powerful yet spiritually empty. Whether this belief was sincere or a desperate shield against despair depended on the individual, but it shaped how America was understood until the very end. Then came the unimaginable. The atomic bombs shattered not only cities but meaning itself. For civilians who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, America became something beyond enemy or conqueror. It became an embodiment of absolute power. The scale of destruction defied explanation. Some believed America had unlocked a force no human should control. Others saw the bomb as proof that resistance was futile. The enemy was no longer just stronger, it had crossed into a realm where traditional ideas of war no longer applied. When surrender was announced, shock swept through Japan. Many civilians felt relief mixed with humiliation. Soldiers felt disbelief, anger, and emptiness. America, once portrayed as weak, then feared as unstoppable, now stood as victor. Yet, what followed confounded expectation. Yet again, when American occupation forces arrived, they did not behave like avenging conquerors. They did not massacre civilians or dismantle society through terror. They organized, administered, fed, and governed. For many Japanese people, this was the most unsettling transformation of all. The enemy who had burned their cities now handed out food. The soldiers who had dropped bombs now enforced order calmly and predictably. Encounters with American troops revealed discipline without cruelty, authority without chaos. Children were surprised to see Americans smile. Adults were surprised to see rules enforced fairly. This behavior clashed violently with years of indoctrination. Japanese civilians noticed details. American soldiers were clean, well-supplied, and oddly informal. They spoke casually, laughed easily, and followed procedures strictly. They did not bow, yet they did not humiliate. They were powerful, yet restrained. This did not erase hatred or grief, but it forced reconsideration. The enemy was not the monster they had been promised, nor was it the hollow society they had been taught to despise. Former soldiers returning home struggled most with this contradiction. Many had lost everything to American firepower, yet they now lived under American authority that allowed rebuilding rather than revenge. Some felt bitterness, others grudging respect. America became associated not only with defeat, but with survival. The nation that had destroyed Japan also prevented its collapse into chaos and famine. Over time, perceptions shifted again. America came to be seen as pragmatic, confident, and secure enough not to demand humiliation. Its power was no longer abstract. It was visible in food shipments, infrastructure projects, and reforms. To many Japanese, America appeared not as a nation driven by hatred, but by systems, rules, and long-term interests. This realization was deeply unsettling because it challenged the idea that moral purity alone defined strength. Looking back, many Japanese reflected on how wrong their early assumptions had been. America was not weak because it valued comfort. It was strong because it could sustain it. It was not undisciplined because it allowed individuality. It was disciplined differently. The enemy they had imagined had never truly existed. What existed instead was something more complex and harder to categorize. And so the war ended not just with cities destroyed and lives lost, but with illusions broken. Japan had entered the conflict believing it understood America. It emerged realizing it never had. The greatest shock was not defeat itself, but the discovery that the enemy was neither monster nor fool, neither decadent collapse nor soulless machine. America was simply a nation that could absorb unimaginable strain, adapt without losing cohesion, and wield power without unraveling. In the end, what Japan thought of America during World War II changed again and again, shaped by fear, ideology, experience, and survival. But the final understanding came only after silence replaced gunfire. America was not the enemy Japan had been taught to hate. It was the reality Japan had been unprepared to face.